Hello, everyone. I'm absolutely thrilled to be here with you today for a deep dive into something we all recognize but rarely truly understand. When we hear the words Nobel Prize, our immediate reaction is to think of it as the ultimate pinnacle of scientific achievement, almost like a symbol of a nation's intellectual power. But have you ever wondered why this specific prize holds such absolute, unquestionable authority? The direct answer is quite fascinating. The Nobel Prize is practically a state-run machine, operated with the full continuous backing of the Swedish nation. Let's just close our eyes and imagine for a second that you are the one who won the prize this year. Around November, your phone rings, and it's the Nobel Committee. They are calling to book your flight to Stockholm, and trust me, it is strictly a first-class ticket. If you decide you want to bring your spouse and children along, the Swedish airlines will often proactively upgrade your entire family's tickets to first class for free. The moment you step off the plane, you aren't just taking a taxi. A dedicated envoy from the Swedish embassy is there to personally receive you. For the entire week you are in Stockholm, you are given a private car and a personal driver. Your very first formal dinner will likely be hosted by your own country's ambassador to Sweden. And when it comes to the actual ceremony, it is the King of Sweden himself who physically hands you the medal and your certificate. At the grand banquet that evening, the entire Swedish royal family, the king, the queen, the princes, and princesses are all in attendance, dining and dancing right alongside you. The prize money itself, which was around 8 million Swedish kronor or roughly 900,000 US dollars recently, is given to you completely tax free. And the cultural immersion is incredible. On the morning of December 13th, which is Sweden's traditional St. Lucia's Day, you will be gently awakened at 6 in the morning by a young Swedish girl dressed in flowing white, carrying a tray of candles. This entire week is known as Nobel Week, and the entire country's television networks, newspapers, and the internet portals are completely blanketed with news about you. This unbelievable, overwhelming level of state-sponsored VIP treatment is the visible surface of the machinery that gives the Nobel Prize its supreme glory. But if we want to dig deeper and find the true origin of this massive state-level treatment, we have to travel back to the year 1896, the year Alfred Nobel passed away and left his will. I like to call this moment a financial singularity. Nobel had been selling dynamite globally for over 20 years, and he had made an astronomical fortune. When his estate was counted, he left behind 31 million Swedish kronor, which was equivalent to over 9 million US dollars during the gold standard era, where $1 equaled 1.5 grams of gold. How absurdly large was this amount of money? To put it in perspective, we have to look at the GDP and the economy of Sweden at the end of the 19th century. The money Nobel left behind was equivalent to 1.7% of Sweden's entire national GDP for that year. To make that even clearer, Sweden's total national tax revenue at the time was only about 10% of its GDP. That means the cash Nobel casually donated was equivalent to roughly 17% of the entire Swedish government's national revenue. If that ratio is hard to picture, let's use a modern everyday comparison. Imagine taking that exact ratio and applying it to a modern economic giant like China today. That donation would be the equivalent of about 2.7 trillion Chinese yuan. To put that in human terms, that is equal to the combined total net worth of 14 of the richest billionaires in the country combined. When a sum of money this unimaginably vast, a sum that literally rivals the wealth of a nation, is dropped onto the table, its sheer weight and power are enough to shake the foundations of any government. This underlying financial hegemony is the precise reason why the Nobel Prize, from its very first year, was executed directly by state institutions rather than a tiny private charity. Backed by a fortune equal to 17% of the nation's revenue, the Nobel Prize immediately transformed into an incredibly powerful soft power machine for Sweden. In his will, Nobel didn't just ask his friends to hand out the money. He directly assigned the task to the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences, the Karolinska Institute, the Swedish Academy, and even the Norwegian Parliament. Normally, if a wealthy businessman wants to give money to scientists, he sets up an independent foundation. He certainly doesn't have the power to boss around royal academies and national parliaments. In fact, in the very beginning, King Oscar II of Sweden was actually quite opposed to the whole idea. He was heartbroken to see such massive mountains of Swedish silver being handed out to foreigners, believing the money should strictly stay within Sweden to fund Swedish scientists. Because of this, the king refused to attend the very first award ceremony in 1901, sending his son, the crown prince, in his place. However, faced with this colossal sum of money, these national institutions had incredible foresight. They realized the unparalleled prestige and the soft power this would bring to human civilization and to Sweden itself. It was an unprecedented national business card. Eventually, the royal family had no choice but to compromise and fully cooperate. And why did Nobel give everything away? Part of it was practical. He was a lifelong bachelor with no heirs. But the deepest psychological driver was guilt. When he was in his early 30s, his dynamite experiments caused an explosion that killed his younger brother and left his father crippled. Although he made a fortune from explosives, he was deeply troubled by his reputation as the merchant of death and the knowledge of how his inventions were used in warfare. In his later years, he desperately wanted to wash away this blood-stained legacy, choosing to donate his immense wealth to the purest symbol of human glory, scientific progress. This prize awarding machine wasn't just born with elite status, it has survived some of the most brutal geopolitical stress tests in history, demonstrating a terrifying operational continuity. For example, in 1905, the political union between Sweden and Norway collapsed, and the two nations split. Yet, despite the tearing apart of the country, the Norwegian parliament, which was put in charge of the Peace Prize, continued to coordinate flawlessly with the Swedish committees. The prize didn't skip a beat. An even more intense test happened right before World War II. In 1936, the Peace Prize was awarded to Karl von Ossietzky, a German pacifist who was actively locked up in a Nazi concentration camp. This completely infuriated Adolf Hitler. In response, Nazi Germany issued a strict decree forbidding any German citizen from accepting a Nobel Prize. When the committee awarded the chemistry and medicine prizes to German scientists in 1938 and 1939, the Nazi government officially wrote to the committee to reject the prizes on behalf of the scientists. But the Nobel Committee, fully aware of the death threats and the Nazi coercion, simply held the line. They kept the medals, the certificates, and the prize money safely locked away for over a decade. Finally, in 1947, long after the war had ended and these scientists had returned to normal life, Sweden re-awarded them their rightful honors. Aside from 7 specific years during the two world wars, where awarding was practically impossible, this institution has functioned like an unbreakable vault. This unwavering independence in the face of absolute tyranny is a huge reason why the prize's status remains utterly unshakable. However, as much as we admire the financial power and state backing, we have to admit that the Nobel Prize is far from perfect. Over the last century, the committee has made some empirical failures, some truly jaw-dropping knowledge-based errors. The most tragic and devastating mistake occurred in 1949 when the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine was awarded for the invention of the lobotomy. This procedure involved driving an ice pick-like instrument through a patient's eye socket to physically destroy the frontal lobe of their brain. The goal was to calm down aggressive psychiatric patients, and yes, it made them quiet, but only because it destroyed their memory, their critical thinking, and their personality, effectively turning them into living zombies. Endorsed by the supreme authority of the Nobel Prize, this barbaric surgery was widely abused globally. Some parents even subjected their misbehaving children to it. Hundreds of thousands of people suffered irreversible brain damage before the procedure was finally banned worldwide about 15 years later. That is undoubtedly the darkest diagnostic failure in Nobel history. Then there are errors that are just downright absurd. In 1906, the chemistry prize went to Henri Moissan, who claimed he had invented a method to artificially manufacture diamonds. Unbeknownst to Moissan, his laboratory assistant, who was suffering under the intense pressure of repeated failed experiments, had secretly slipped a real natural diamond into the chemical mixture to fake a success. The committee was completely fooled. The bitter irony of this mistake is that in that exact same year of 1906, the great Dmitry Mendeleev and his periodic table of elements were nominated, but the committee passed him over for a fake diamond. Beyond the actual scientific errors, the foundational rules designed by Nobel himself have created immense structural regrets. The most famous of these is the rigid rule of three constraint. Nobel's will strictly mandated that a single prize cannot be shared by more than three individuals. While this made sense in the late 19th century, an era dominated by the romantic idea of the solo genius, it has become painfully inadequate for modern highly collaborative science. A classic example is the 1957 Physics Prize awarded to Chen Yang and Cong Dao Li for the theory of parity non-conservation. While their theoretical framework was brilliant, the entire theory hinged on a groundbreaking, incredibly complex experimental verification. That crucial experiment was painstakingly designed and executed by the brilliant female physicist Qian Wu in collaboration with Ernest Ambler at a low-temperature lab. Scientifically speaking, Wu was absolutely essential to this discovery. But here was the problem. Adding Wu and Ambler to the ticket would mean four winners. Faced with this strict institutional limit, the committee simply dropped the experimentalists and gave the prize only to the two theorists. It was a heartbreaking loss. There are also cases where the lab director, who never touched a beaker, got the prize, while the tireless graduate student who actually made the discovery, like in the case of pulsars, was completely ignored. As science increasingly relies on massive global networks and massive funding, this archaic three-person limit is becoming a heavy chain around the neck of the Nobel Prize. Sometimes, judging the worth of a scientific discovery isn't just about right or wrong, it's about the terrifying complexity of its long-term consequences. Take the story of DDT, the famous pesticide. Its inventor was awarded the Nobel Prize in Medicine in 1948. Fast forward to the 1960s and 1970s, and humanity realized that DDT was an environmental nightmare, poisoning the soil, the water, and severely damaging the food chain. Countries like the United States rightfully banned it completely. If the story stopped there, we would easily classify this as another massive Nobel blunder. But history is rarely that simple. In the decades following the global ban, extremely impoverished regions in Africa and Southeast Asia lost access to the only cheap, effective mosquito killer they had. Because they couldn't afford the expensive green alternatives, they suffered massive, devastating outbreaks of malaria. The death toll from these mosquito-borne diseases far eclipsed the environmental damage DDT had caused. Faced with this grim reality, several nations had to re-legalize DDT just to keep their people alive. This incredible story perfectly illustrates a core tenet of modern scientific thinking. Science is astonishingly complex. When we evaluate a scientific fact or intervention, we cannot let human emotions blind us. It doesn't matter how sincere the scientist was, how hard they worked, or how pure their intentions were. Objective truths and natural laws are entirely indifferent to human suffering and human effort. To truly understand the world, we have to learn to filter out our emotions and look at the cold, hard, multidimensional facts. Moving away from the controversies, if we look at the Nobel Prize today, it acts as a fascinating diagnostic tool for where modern science is heading. A very popular running joke in the scientific community is that the Nobel Prize in chemistry should actually be called the Nobel Prize in comprehensive science. People joke that biologists can win it, physicists can win it, and the actual pure chemists are often left standing on the sidelines. And the statistics absolutely back this up. Out of all the chemistry laureates in history, roughly one-third of them are not classified as chemists at all. Dozens of times, the chemistry prize has been handed directly to discoveries in biology and genetics. Over a dozen times, it has gone to physicists. Take the year 2013, for example. The chemistry prize was awarded for developing multi-scale models for complex chemical systems. Of the three winners that year, only one was a pure chemist, the second was a biophysicist, and the third was a biologist. You rarely see this kind of massive invasion in the physics or medicine prizes. So every October, when the chemistry prize is about to be announced, people in the field aren't just wondering times who times one. They are anxiously waiting to see if another discipline completely stole their prize again. But this isn't a sign that chemistry is dying. On the contrary, it is a brilliant reflection of how rapidly human knowledge is expanding and how the rigid walls between disciplines are beautifully falling apart. So, why exactly are the borders of chemistry becoming so incredibly blurry? Let's use a relatable everyday analogy: learning a foreign language. Think of chemistry as the basic vocabulary of a language. You spend years memorizing how individual words work, but eventually you don't just want to recite words, you want to write poetry or draft an essay. When a scientist takes the rules of chemical reactions and applies them to something incredibly complex, like DNA strands or the proteins functioning inside a human cell, they are using chemical words to write a biological story. They instantly step across the border into molecular biology and medicine. This upward expansion explains why so many biologists win the chemistry prize. But what about the downward expansion? Imagine you know a lot of words, and suddenly you start wondering about their deep historical roots. Why does this specific Chinese character look the way it does? You start studying ancient history and etymology. Similarly, when scientists stop just mixing chemicals in a beaker to see what happens and instead use fundamental laws of quantum mechanics to mathematically predict and calculate the reaction before it even happens, they are digging into the basement of chemistry. They have crossed into physics. Historically, every scientific discipline was like an isolated bubble being slowly blown up. Today, those bubbles have grown so massive that they are touching, overlapping, and merging into one another. In other areas of human life, like politics or religion, when borders collide, it usually results in conflict, hostility, or outright war. But in the realm of science, because everything is tethered to the ultimate test of objective reality, these border collisions result in peaceful, incredible fusions of knowledge. Now, we absolutely have to address the most famous piece of Nobel gossip out there. If science is so deeply interconnected, why on earth is there no Nobel Prize for mathematics? I'm sure many of you have heard the legendary, incredibly juicy rumor. The story goes that Alfred Nobel had a beautiful fiancée who betrayed him and eloped with a dashing, brilliant mathematician. Because of this bitter heartbreak, Nobel supposedly held a lifelong grudge and specifically refused to create a math prize, terrified that his prize money might one day be handed to his romantic rival. It sounds like a perfect movie plot, but historical records prove it is 100% pure fiction. Let's look at his actual love life. He had a brief romance with his private secretary, but she eventually left to marry her ex boyfriend, who had absolutely nothing to do with mathematics. Later in life, he had an exhausting 15-year relationship with a flower girl who eventually married a military officer, again, totally unrelated to math. So, where did this wild rumor come from? It all traces back to a very prominent Swedish mathematician named Gustav Mittag-Leffler. Mittag-Leffler was a powerful figure with dozens of honorary titles, and he led a massive academic faction that was in a bitter, fierce rivalry with Stockholm University. In early drafts of Nobel's will, he had considered leaving 5% of his fortune to Stockholm University. Gossips simply took this academic rivalry, mixed it with Nobel's fame, and spun a fake love triangle. Ultimately, Nobel rewrote his will numerous times and decided to scrap all those small local donations anyway, pooling his money for global scientific achievements. If the love triangle is a myth, what is the real reason? The answer lies in Nobel's epistemological filter, his core, unshakable worldview. In his final will, he explicitly demanded that the prizes be awarded to those who have conferred the greatest benefit to mankind. This single phrase is the ultimate standard for his value judgment. To Nobel, a 19th century industrialist, benefit meant practical, tangible, real world utility. It meant things that could improve human life or industry right now. Pure mathematics, by its very nature, is a pursuit of pure logic, mental architecture, and abstract beauty. It doesn't have immediate, tangible applications. If you start applying math to build bridges or understand markets, you're doing physics or economics, not pure math. We have to remember Nobel's background. He grew up receiving private tutoring just to prepare him to take over his father's factory. He entered the industrial workforce at age 17. He made a staggering fortune inventing and selling dynamite. And in the mid 19th century, chemical engineering only required the absolute basics of math: addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. He didn't need calculus. He didn't need a linear algebra. The deep, beautiful marriage between advanced mathematics and physics, things like quantum mechanics and relativity, didn't happen until roughly a decade after Nobel had died. During his lifetime, the greatest mathematicians of the era, geniuses like Gauss and Riemann, were living on modest means. There was an immense class divide. The incredibly wealthy industrialists who had the financial power to create global prizes simply lacked the educational background to understand the profound underlying power of abstract mathematics. The lack of a math prize wasn't born from a lover's quarrel. It was born from the practical limitations of one man's era. As we step back and look at the more than 120 years of the Nobel Prize history, we realize it is essentially a gigantic mirror, perfectly reflecting the evolution of modern human knowledge. It was ignited by a financial singularity and forged into the ultimate symbol of human intellect by the deliberate, strategic soft power of the Swedish state. Yet, looking closely at this mirror, we can see the cracks and the scratches. It reflects our terrifying human errors, like the tragedy of the lobotomy, showing us that even the highest scientific authorities are fallible. It reveals the rigid constraints of our own rulemaking, like how the rule of three tragically leaves essential collaborators in the shadows. But it also shows us something beautiful. Through the phenomenon of the Comprehensive Science Chemistry Prize, we see how the distinct, isolated bubbles of biology, chemistry, and physics have expanded and merged into a breathtaking, unified web of understanding. And finally, the sheer absence of a mathematics prize serves as a humbling reminder that even the grandest philanthropic visions are still bound by the personal backgrounds and the practical worldviews of their creators. Understanding the Nobel Prize in its complete, unvarnished reality, its supreme glory, its dark histories, its structural flaws, and its ongoing evolution gives us a much richer, much more nuanced perspective on how human science actually advances. Thank you so much for joining me in this deep dive today, and I hope this exploration gives you a fresh, critical lens through which to view not just the Nobel Prize, but the beautiful complexity of the world itself.